In the AICA COSIC call for papers, this query appears, quote, is it really criticism which decides what is accepted and rejected? And what methods does it employ in its research procedures? My answer is resolutely no. Issues regarding the arts are far more complicated today, especially with the dominant influence of global art markets. 3. In this paper, I will attempt to explain how an art market and not critics legitimize cultural products today. I argue there is an analogy between social movement success and recognition as art, so that the major concepts that explain the paths of social movements appear as well as to art worlds. The concepts are economics, power, political opportunity, structures, resources, mobilization, branding, and framing. Two noted theorists, Arthur Danto and Pierre Bourdieu, define the art world very differently. For Danto, the art world provides a working theory of art that participants use to distinguish art from non-art. Danto saw it as an interpretive community that learns the codes and categories for art, codes that are not perceptible or noticeable properties or characteristics in things or artifacts themselves. Danto's view is mainly informative and conceptual, not sociological, yet compatible with Bourdieu's description. Nonetheless, to Bourdieu, the art world is a type of conditioned echelon or a grouping determined by social and economic lived positions in institutions, requiring knowledge and ownership of cultural capital as part of a social class identity. The concept of art follows learned professional and social class distinctions. Institutions function as socializing structures for reproducing cultural capital for its owners. And although there is relevance in Danto's perception of the art world, I feel today it is more significantly aligned to Bourdieu's interpretation. Next slide. Contemporary art is constrained by its institutionalization within a cultural industry. For him, one's education provides certain social groups with access to what he referred to as cultural capital. Cultural capital should be kept distinct from other forms of cultural competence, which Paul DiMaggio denotes as cultural resources. While cultural capital is institutionalized as legitimate and valuable at the societal level, cultural resources have more localized effects and are not subject to authoritarian and ritualized forms of valuation by dominant institutions. For Bourdieu, in the arts consumption domain, let's leave it here, it consists of a generalized aesthetic disposition or capacity to conceive aesthetic objects and styles hailing from a heterogeneous realms, whether associated with fine art or not. In particular, this involves the unequally distributed capacity to habitually separate the formal properties of cultural objects from their content and function. Prior to the internet and a proliferation of auction houses, learning of artworks' existence, their sales histories, and what they cost when last sold was about as easy as reading Leonardo's mirror image cursive. Robert Robinson articulates, quote, "Today there are no art movements, only market movements," close quote. In our day, in the way that online investing has blasted the lid off the aura once refined by stockbrokers, services such as artnet.com, Value Data Catalog, lets us in on artworks in play. It assists one to hunt pieces by artists and alerts you when various works start moving to the market. This tool is used by many a curator, a collector, boards of directors, and the dealer. This is just a synopsis of what I've written on the art world. And I apologize for this, but this computer is not behaving. There is the matter of art's coyness about its business side, which Olav Viltius has written about in the art newspaper and elsewhere. There continues to be a considerable resistance to the idea that a gallery is only a shop. The art fair is really a shopping mall, and the art just another luxury product to set alongside with jewelry, antiques, yachts, and whatever. In the boom years of contemporary art, huge numbers of new collectors were drawn in, and the art world lost its Euro-American axis. As art has become more globalized, its distinct minority culture has been eroded. In its stead, celebrity, publicity, branding, and the glitzy display of riches come to the fore, a common vulgarity, if you like it. The price of a given artwork is determined by insider world of cultural arbitrators who coordinate with one another. Many know long before the rest of us which new artist is going to be shown, is going to have a big show, even who will be trashed in a review and whose piece was just sold privately for a small fortune. This is a quote from Adam Davidson, How the Art Market Thrives on Inequality. Insiders do not gain this information from reading critics' reviews and articles. Contemporary artists operating outside these market contexts, collaborating with or addressing communities outside the primary culture industry, oft do not possess a model of production that would allow them to engage fully with the people with whom they are working. Rideau's analysis back in the 90s reveals a relationship between culture and power in the reproduction of inequality in a larger society. He saw the art world and distinct international art events as serving to propagate certain viewpoints sequentially to maintain certain controlling myths and power. The myths about great art and taste justify the maintenance of hierarchical distinction among different social categories. It is a dynamic force that imposed on the self-conception of members of a specific group that either are part of the informed or excluded from access to the fine arts and the inner high culture. Let's go to the next. The art fairs particularly mirror this system of market control. And then the next. And then leave. The artist and writer Martha Rossler believes that, quote, no discursive matrix is required for successful investments by mutual and national hosts in the market. Yet art fairs have delicately tried to pull a blanket of respectability over the naked profit motive by installing a smattering of curated exhibitions among the dealer booths and hosting on-site conferences with invited intellectual critical luminaries. But perhaps one should say that discursive matrices are always required if they take the form of books and magazines in publishers' fair booths. But intellectuals talking in rooms and walking and stalking the floors can definitely not hurt. Let's go to the next. Enabled by the rise of technological interactivity, inexpensive travel, and the concomitant rise of art tourism, the biannual and art fairs are now a system, a network through which viewers, artists, artworks, curators, and discursive concepts travel, pausing momentarily at specific points in space and time before moving on to the next location. Next week, Friday, the 4th of October, a new Carnegie International will open. Of the 40-some artists, only 2 will be from Central Europe. They include Paulina Oloswat, and I probably will butcher this name, forgive me, Olovska, and Mladen Stilnovic from Zagreb, Croatia. But do keep in mind, both artists have gallery and museum representation in the United States. I am in you can turn it the next. I am in agreement with Irving Sandler, who wrote last year in the Brooklyn Rail. Apart from the power of market, there is another reason why art critics have lost much of their influence as arbitrators of art, notably the growth of pluralism in the postmodern era. You can go to the next. During the modernist period, art critics took sides for or against avant-garde styles, such as color field painting, assemblage, environments, earth art, conceptual, and so on. Sandler continues to say that in the current after-post era, there are no longer riveting polemics that absorb critics. Instead, critics tend to be reduced to choosing artists they admire and, in rare cases, dislike. Instead, they deal with each individually, write catalogs, and champion. Art world discourse has become unfocused and undramatic and has fallen into a kind of disarray, and in the minds of many, irrelevant. Prior to coming here, I called artists in Chicago, New York, and in Pittsburgh, and I asked them, tell me what you think of art criticism. Several said it was irrelevant to their practice. Many said, I don't bother to read it. And some say, unless it's really bad or it would appear in the New York Times, who gives a damn? John Asbury perfectly, if inadvertently, summed up this new situation in his work, Notes from the Air, Selected Later Poems. Quote, confused minions swarmed on the quarter deck. No one was giving orders anymore, close quote. Can anyone stop the player piano before it rolls us in the trough of a tidal wave? How did we get to be so many, close quote. Deborah Solomon does feel art criticism does matter. Quote, the last full-time art critic in the city of Chicago was recently laid off by Time Out magazine. Now there are fewer than 10 full-time art critics employed by newspapers and magazines in the United States. What is disappearing, however, is not the art critic. You could argue that with the expansion of websites and social media, there are now more than ever before more critics. However, the tradition of a regularly reoccurring voice in a widely circulated paper, magazine, or journal, people have the opportunity to be exposed to a variety of art to a broad audience on a continuous basis. That voice begins to be listened to, and now increasingly it has been silenced. Go to the next. This is just a statistical amount of information about art fairs. We started out with very few in the 90s. In the 70s, we had 4, in the 90s, we had 50. And this year, if you have the time and money, you could go to 180. Let's go to the next. Despite the proliferation of art writing out in cyberspace today, criticism now exists on the sidelines as the assistant coach waiting for Mr. Market Coach to call the shots. This said, artists do have a choice in choosing what type of game they opt to play and who is their audience. Let's go to the next. I am in agreement with Hans Hacke, who recently wrote that it is time for artists to stop, pause, and reassess how they're going to move forward in the presence of this giant market. Artists do have the power to say yes or no to this game altogether. History showed us this in the 19th century with the original Salon des Refusés in Paris in 1863, showing works rejected by the official salon. Only 2,217 paintings out of more than 5,000 were accepted. Artists have more power than we think, because if you take the artist out of the equation, there is no art world, there is no art market. I'm going to end my presentation with a satirical allegory by a man by the name of John Seed, who I think says things quite accurately. And do keep in mind that art criticism is the wife and Mr. Market is the husband. This is a press release released on 12/21/2012, New York. In a joint prepared statement issued today, the art market and art criticism to allegorical known figures whose uneasy marriage has been under visible strain in the past months have now confirmed reports they will divorce. After long and careful consideration on our parts, we've decided to end our marriage. Yes, we have loved each other deeply for many years, but recent developments have strained our ability to sustain a meaningful partnership. It is a painful time for all involved, so we ask you to respect our requested privacy. The announcement ended considerable speculation, fueled by a spate of reports in tabloids and art blogs that this marriage was in critical trouble. This came less than a week after reports that the artist Damien Hirst was ending his affiliation with the Gagosian Gallery. The news rattled their friends and associates who struggled to make sense of this seismic instability that has shaken the art world. One party close to the situation of the divorcing couple says the marriage's problems first became apparent after art criticism, a classically trained scholar known for her wit and erudition, and her husband, a high-powered businessman and financier, engaged in a nasty public shoving in front of Jeff Koons' balloon dog on the roof of the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. The following week, art criticism was observed by a neighbor leaving the couple's palatial Manhattan brownstone, clutching a Goya painting in one hand and a box of books in the other. A blurry cell phone tried to get these across the internet, but it was quickly taken down. Musée Board, a longtime friend of the pair, told the New York Sun that art criticism has been enduring considerable pain and strain in the last year because the art market has been spending so much time at art fairs with oligarchs and billionaires. Art criticism has been relying heavily on her friends, but they have their own problems. The deaths of certain critics, including Bob Hughes, and now the recent firing of Blake Gopnik from Newsweek, did not help. There are now endless bloggers, of course, who call themselves critics, but they are too self-absorbed to be of much help. Another friend, Christy Sotheby, offered this observation about art criticism's social circle. She is just now beginning to realize that many artists who she thought as her friends have actually only been sucking up to her for years. Once they had become brands, they told her off and laughed in her face. Art Forum, a close friend of Art Market, offered a somewhat different perspective. As anyone with a pair of eyeballs can see, the art market has been widely successful in the past decade. And I think this grated on art criticism, who honestly never really embraced the same success. There is jealousy there, and I would remind Miss Criticism that her husband has been extremely generous in her lifestyle. By the way, she needs to tell her busybody friends, Dave Hickey and Sarah Thornton, to shut up. A source that declined to be identified hinted the affair might have been an affair might have been a factor. Last summer, photos of the art market sipping champagne with curatorial integrity at a London bistro briefly appeared at the Tater website, but what was quickly removed. This is a very sad moment, the source commented, as the couple complimented each other so well. But you do know art criticism does have a sharp tongue, and she can be very funny, and through the years, I think she has really stabilized art market in giving him some credibility. Honestly, I think he continues to live in a bubble. Ms. Connie Foe, a professor of art theory at the New School of Linguistic Obfuscation and a longtime associate of art criticism, told Art News that she was conceptually saddened by the pending divorce. During their long marriage, art criticism and art market functioned symbiotically within a web of difference which spans the chasm of the non-human over which we constantly live. However, art criticism's mother, art history, has made only one public comment posted as a status update on her Facebook page. They never should have married in the first place. I told her so when they became engaged. From the start, they were totally incompatible with different aims and values. Art market and art criticism have 3 children: Pablo, a hedge fund manager; Andy, a filmmaker; and Jean-Michel, a street artist who struggles with drugs and alcohol. The couple will reportedly share custody of their 10-year-old adopted daughter, the Chinese contemporary art market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I anticipate a good discussion here.
I'm going to sit
The
here.
gentleman over there was first, I
feel
think.
like I'm being interrogated with lights.
Môžeme poprosiť túto trošku stiahnuť svetla a viacej do publika zasvietiť? Ďakujem.
Am I on the air? You hear me? I'm Dag Solhjell from Norway. Thank you, Ellaine A. King, for an excellent lecture. Witty, intelligent, and well-researched. I want to put your suggestion for a divorce even sharper, because art is also a second-hand product. So there will always be a market. But what you have to make a divorce between, that is between curatorship and critics. The curators are paid by the market. So a suspicion of corruption being paid for your critic is very nearly for me to have. So we must make a divorce, I think, between curatorship and art criticism. What do you think about that?
As the movie said, it's complicated. I really feel, as I was showing you this kind of web with art fairs, and then I went earlier to, it's too bad we can't just go back to the functions. I'd like to go back to the slide.
I have to go all the way up.
This is crazy, this machine. Normally you just go like this on the Mac and this is.
to be all put together, so I don't know.
It's weird. I think it's incestuous. I think many a curator is afraid to think for themselves. I think many a curator is in the lap of the gallery. I won't say which show, but I happen to know for fact that there was a major show of which 50% of the artists were picked from one gallery because the curator and the dealer were having an affair. So I think it's not only criticism, I think it's also the dealers, the curators, and I think part of it is there's a fear factor. There is such power now on boards of directors. Now, again, I don't know Central European system. I don't know all the other institutions' system, but the people on the boards in the US have so much power, so much money, and really control, and many are collectors. I really believe that it's a very incestuous situation. And also, many a curator is afraid to what I say is genuinely hunt, to go to a region just because they want to see what is there. When I was working full-time as a museum director and a curator, besides, one of you said about your job as director is all you do is chase money, and there's a lot of truth to that. But for me, I would always insist on curating a few shows a year because it's the only thing that kept the blood going in the veins, is to engage in the hunt, to find artists, to really search. And it did not matter if an artist was known. I'll never forget when I was a young curator right out of graduate school, and I was curating a show, and suddenly I needed to fill a space because the work came in from another artist and there was not enough to fill a large space. So I quickly flew to New York and I went to 2 or 3 galleries, and I walked into John Weber's gallery, which is now closed, and he had this project room, and I walked in, and maybe the room was from here to here, and then entered. And this young artist, I forget her name now, made these little boxes. She made these little tiny boxes of like, and there was a hole, and you had to look in. And they were like dioramas, but they were interesting in the sense of kind of a social, critical commentary about urban life. But they were magical. And I walked out to the front desk and I said, "Are these available?" And he said, "Yeah, none of them have been sold." I said, "Great, could they get packed up and I could send a truck on Monday to pick them up? I'd love to show them in 2 weeks at the Carnegie Mellon Art Gallery. I'm doing the Hillon Bernbecher downstairs, and I'm doing this other artist from LA, and then I'll have room for this." And he says, "But you don't even know who this artist is." I said, "But she's in your gallery. I like the work. Don't you want to see her resume?" I said, "Yeah, you could give it to me because I'll need it for the press release. But you don't care where she's shown before?" "No." I said, "This is good work. Who cares? I mean, maybe the first time I'll discover her besides you. You trust her to put her in your gallery on the Upper West East Side, so why can't I put her in my gallery?" There was shock amongst people that I would dare. I mean, I got the work, but the look on people's face that I didn't check, "Oh, she was in the Whitney Biennial. She shone at MIT, and maybe will be showing at the Kunsthalle in Bern." No, but that is called over-the-shoulder curating, because you're always looking, well, was she in the Whitney Biennial? Was she in Documenta? Was she at the Arsenale? Is she with Mary Boone? Is she with David Zwerner? Who cares? Half the work in those shows are horrible. When my faculty look for new faculty, some of them will say, "Oh, look, this person's applying for the job. They were in the Whitney Biennial." I said, "Oh my God, don't tell me. Did you see the Whitney Biennial? It was horrible. Maybe that's not good that she was in the Whitney Biennial." But what I'm talking about earlier was branding, name dropping, framing. And it's part of the problem, like you mentioned, about curating. But why isn't the curator willing to take the risk? Why isn't the curator willing to acknowledge something is good, even though it is not famous? So I hope I answered your question. I didn't?
Hello.
I believe, I said do think that it is a problem. I acknowledge it. I acknowledge it is a problem. But I do think the curator, and it's more the curator and the dealer and the museum than the critic. That's my opinion.
A curator is for sale, a critic cannot be.
I don't think I understand.
Sorry, there was a question before, so...
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No. She was before you.
Okay. When you talk about yes, art market should divorce with the art criticism, so my question is, how criticism survived? Because he has 3 babies. He should survive by the family. So who will pay for art criticism?
Nobody pays for it anyway. Do you ever see what Art America pays? Art Forum? Sculpture Magazine? You would die of starvation if you made your money on art criticism. If you're lucky, you get $150 for an article, and if you write a major piece, you maybe get $500, and you don't get those that often. So I don't believe an art critic makes their living unless you were before working full-time. There are so few critics who get any money. You cannot survive on art criticism.
Now that's China's problem, because the art critics yes, pay for the commercial galleries, pay for the artists, pay for the, how to say, yes, the medium. So if I just, how to say, try to clarify, yes, okay, if it's a divorce, so art criticism is without money, how to be independent? That's my question.
I'm saying that it's more the artist who's controlled than the critic. The critic, no one cares anymore about the critic. I hate to say it, but it's true. We are a minority and a dying breed. People only will look to certain criticism if it's in the New York Times or the LA Times. I'm not certain it has the role. Yes, Marjorie.
I disagree with this bifurcation between critic and curator, because I know plenty of curators who I regard as engaging with a critical practice, and who also write, many of them, but they do tend to be not in the big museums, but in small non-profit spaces, certainly in the UK, which are under threat because they eschew boards with rich collectors or rich hedge fund managers. But unfortunately, with public funding being squeezed, they're now being compromised by the same forces that have compromised the museums, certainly in the States. And I would like to see critics and curators of that caliber and that complexion joining forces in protecting good critical practice from commercial and art market imperatives. And I think this division, this false division between critic and curator, we've got to resist that, because even Pierre Restonnet, another generation, was arguing very early on that criticism is a distributed practice. It is not solely in the hands of the person who is in print, but also those who are engaged with artists, sometimes as accomplices, because, as our Ecuadorian colleague pointed out, in certain political and social contexts, the critic is an accomplice of the artist because they both share a critical project, which is to do with resistance or social and political ends.
No, I agree with the critic. Of course, the curator is having a critical position by selectivity. However, there are many a critic who will find a group of artists and they will keep showing them and then writing about them, then I pause and say, where's the criticality? Because eventually those people become your friends, and you know, how do you draw that line? And I'll give you an example. There is one of the best artists in Pittsburgh named Diane Samuels. I met her first objectively, and first I began to write about her for different magazines because I really liked her work. But over time, I became a very close friend. So then I said to her, I can no longer review your shows. I can write a catalog essay. I can periodically invite you to be in a show if I'm guest curating, but don't count on it all the time. I think there are these fine lines of, and maybe I'm old school, but hey, I was raised Catholic, I'm hardwired that way. I believe in ethics. I am a believer of ethics, and I don't put my friends in a lot of things, and I will not write a review about you if you're my close friend. We have a colleague of mine at my university who just curated a show, and the man she lives with is in the show, her best friend is in the show, her sister is in the show. I wouldn't even bother to go look at this show. I realize that Habsburgs have come to this show, and if we know the history of the Habsburgs, we can know what we'll expect.
I think, Ellaine,
Sorry, there was a question before.
Yes, well,
Sorry.
it's not a question, just or a question that I will leave to the audience. But first of all, thank you very much for a very exciting paper, very well done. Thank you. I think it's true. There's a lot of conflict of interest between the curator and the critic, but I think between critics, curators, artists, I mean, we all live in the same world and we become friends, and of course it becomes embarrassing when an artist you like becomes a bad artist, and then you don't know what to say about it anymore.
Exactly.
But I wanted to say I also agree with Marjorie, because, you know, at AICA France we have a lot of critics members that are curators too. So of course it's a question of ethics for them, you know, the way they choose to behave.
Right.
But one thing you said is that the critics have no power anymore, and I tend to believe that. But it's very questioning for me, because galleries, museums, artists are still expecting reviews and articles. So I tend to believe that someone is trying to convince us that critics are unuseful, but I think we are useful, and the art world still needs us. So maybe we should think about what's happening exactly, and why is there so much interest in having a paper in a magazine, an art journal, and then on the other side trying to say us, well, you know, we don't look for your point of view. So I don't know what you think about.
But I think increasingly criticism is disappearing in the papers, because if you, like, I get every day the New York Times. So on Friday, I really read it because that's the most art writing coverage, and it really brings you up to date, particularly if there's a new younger artist, emerging artist. At the same time, on Sunday now, there is so little, unless it's a big story. If you start to track it, the art page is always the last page now in the back. It's the last page in the back. The Chicago Tribune, is Sandra here? Snodgrass, is she? No? I don't think there's a full-time critic in Chicago anymore. Not in the newspaper. I think, I'm not saying I like the fact. Please don't think I like the fact. I'm looking at, and this is part of the reason I dug to these different sources of Sandler and usually Deborah Solomon just will tell you like it is. It was disheartening to learn that there are only 10 full-time critics. I mean, even Michael Kimmelman, who I used to enjoy in the New York Times, seldom even writes anymore. And he had a voice, and this is where I talk about a voice, you wanted to hear that voice. And the other voice they haven't gotten rid of, and I'm grateful for, is Roberta Smith, because she will tell it the way she sees it. You could agree, you may not agree. I'm not saying I want this situation, but I think there's so much more afoot that is.
I
Well,
think,
Wait,
Sorry.
he's not finished, wait.
Nie, nie, nie.
Don't you think there's a part of intox? I mean, it's not true, in fact. I mean, the economic maybe, it's a hard time for the economic, so there's less and less full-time critics, paid by the journals or the newspapers, but still people are looking for the articles.
But I think this is, excuse me, I wanted to say something just about that, because I have the feeling that there's the notion that art criticism is like very pure, and it's not. I mean, it's just as impure as is possibly, a curator and or any wheel in the machinery of art, of the art world. So I kind of resist this notion that there's this. Here's the art critic who is completely free of the art market. And
I would say that earlier, I think you had critics with very strong points of view, and they did. They didn't care, like it or not, they would express that point of view and would not flip-flop because it would be fashionable. She's next, here.
because I used to be a newspaper critic. I wrote for the Tribune newspapers for 5 years. My editor, he would always say, I can't even have a beer with the mayor. I mean, there's a total ethics in journalism that an art critic has to follow. I could not write any kind of, I couldn't do anything. And I wasn't paid hardly anything. I mean, it's like a priesthood. So the issue really here is professional ethics, that I think it should be addressed, maybe not in this context, but if newspaper criticism is dying, and that is a standard of purity, because it's a journalistic ethics that you're bringing to art criticism, then we need to reevaluate what criticism is. And I just want to put something else out. I think your talk was incredible, on every level, and also the timing, because I don't think we can look at things the same way after this Venice Biennale, because with putting Carl Jung at the center of it, and then showing artists that were underground, not even considered professional artists, working in prisons, working in the streets, in this Biennale, that is a total reaction to the market, and everything moves in cycles. So now we're obviously in a new cycle, and now what is our role as critics? Because I write for Huffington Post, I don't get paid, and nobody edits me in the sense that I'm never censored, but I feel my role is to bring a critical consciousness, especially to this networking and, the kind of media that's out there that's not criticized. So it's like, what is our role in this new
I think it's taking
landscape?
taking a position, and I agree with you that the pavilion, the Italian pavilion, the encyclopedia pavilion was refreshing. It was daunting in its size, but it was refreshing to see so many artists that you were writing down the names and going, who is this? I never heard of this, or, this is interesting. I felt the curator was trying to think for themselves, and this, I think, is a very important